Hello and welcome to another revision vodcast, and this one is all about the Liberal government and the House of Lords from 1909 to 1911. Now, one of the most important things to understand about this topic is that it was a huge political victory for the Liberal government when they managed to reduce the power of the Conservative dominated House of Lords. So I'm going to take you through what basically happened between these years and tell you a few things about the main characters involved and exactly how things developed. Don't forget you can watch this video embedded on historyhelper.co.uk, or you can go straight to YouTube and go to the History Helper channel. So let's begin. Now then, in the United Kingdom we live in a parliamentary democracy. So here is the House of Commons and the House of Lords, the famous site of Parliament in London, and democracy of course means that the people get to vote in their government. Now the Parliament is divided, and still is today, and was in the Edwardian times, between the House of Commons. Now these are elected representatives known as MPs, elected by the people, and then the House of Lords, which is known as the upper chamber. Now in Edwardian times this was a hereditary thing, so if you were a duke or an earl, some sort of nobleman, it was a title that you had inherited from your father, and you would therefore get your seat in the Lords by virtue of your family, and not because you'd been voted for by the people. Now, during this time, the Commons obviously were elected by the people, and they had a Liberal majority, and the House of Lords had a Conservative majority. So, let's just reinforce this point. The House of Commons had a Liberal majority after the 1906 election. Don't forget the Liberals had won with a landslide. And that's because they'd promised wholesale social and political reform. Now the House of Lords had a Conservative majority, and it was largely opposed to reform. So you can see that when it came to laws being passed, there was obviously going to be some tension between the two houses of Parliament. Now in order for something to become law in this country, the first thing that must happen is that House of Commons must vote to create a new law. Once the Commons has voted for it, that then passes up to the House of Lords, who then also have to vote for it, and then it gets what's called royal assent, which is where the monarch, the king or the queen, signs it into law. Now, if the Lords reject something the Commons say, that can cause problems, and it can stop the Commons getting the chance to make a law. Now, this is what happens. David Lloyd George. Now, he was the Liberal Chancellor in 1909, and he gave his annual budget to the House of Commons. He planned to continue with the social reform policies, but needed to increase taxes on the rich to pay for them. The Liberal Commons passed the budget, but the Conservative House of Lords rejected it. Now, how are they going to solve this problem? Well, Lloyd George persuaded Asquith, who was the Prime Minister, to hold an election to prove to the Lords that the people wanted reforms. In other words, if the general public supported what the Liberals wanted to do, in other words tax the rich to give money for new reforms, then they would win the election. Now the Liberals did win the election, and the Lords were forced to back down, and it was proved to them the people wanted it, and so the budget was passed. However, Lloyd George now knew that the Lords would probably try and prevent further reforms being passed. So in 1910 he drafted what's called the Parliament Bill, also known as the Parliament Act. Now this meant that the Lords would no longer be able to block a budget. In other words, anything to do with money, the Lords couldn't stop the government from spending the money. Other laws could only be held up for a maximum of 2 years, and effectively the House of Lords would be stripped of a significant amount of power. But there's a problem, of course. Because in order to make the Parliament Act law, the Liberals would have to get the Lords themselves to actually pass it. So you're asking the very people who are about to give up their powers to vote to give up the powers. So it's unlikely. It meant agreeing to take away their own powers, and the Conservative majority would be able to block the law. So this is what happens, and there's a rather odd chain of events. So the Liberal Commons passed the Parliament Act. It then goes to the House of Lords, as every law has to, and of course the Conservative Lords reject it. So the Liberal government tries the same tactic as they did with the budget. They hold an election and they win it. Now, last time the Lords backed down, but this time they don't. They hold their ground. So it goes back into the Commons. The Liberal Commons pass the Act, and here we go. The Conservative Lords reject it again. Now at this point there's total stalemate. It seems that there's no way the Liberals are going to be able to actually get this law passed. So they play a trump card. Alright, now this is very, very important. King George V. Now the King is sympathetic to what the Liberal government are trying to do to make the lives of the poor better. So the King told Asquith, the Prime Minister, that if the Lords rejected the Parliament Act again, he would then create 100 new Liberal Lords. This would wipe out the Conservative majority. In return, the Commons would agree to elections every 5 years, and also that MPs would be paid a salary. Now, under the threat of the King wiping out the Conservative majority, the Lords basically backed down. They knew that if they lost, the Conservative Lords, if they lost their majority, it would be bad for them in the long run. So they backed down. But essentially the Parliament Act, which was now law, meant that the Lords could no longer block the will of the people. Now one of the reasons this is very important is because it meant that Britain virtually became a total democracy. Don't forget, women couldn't vote yet, so it wasn't a full, true democracy. But this was a huge step in the right direction. During the late 19th century, the late 1800s, many working class people were able to vote. Now, the House of Lords, the conservative, rich landowning class who previously held all the power, have now had their power significantly reduced. So it's a huge step towards making Britain a true modern democracy. So, make sure you understand that the reform of the House of Lords counts as a major political success for the Liberal government, and it's a very, very important topic for you to learn. Okay, now I hope that's helpful. Don't forget, give me feedback. Had lots of feedback for previous tutorials, which is fantastic. You can send them to admin@historyhelper.co.uk, or you can go to the feedback page on History Helper, and let me just remind you where that is. Let's bring up History Helper here, and you can see that the feedback page, the contact me, is this little page down here. You'll be able to view this particular tutorial and others at the History Helper TV link just on the side menu here. Okay, hope that's been useful, and I'll see you soon. Bye bye.